Welcome my YouTube channel Storytime. The sun shone brightly over the small, sleepy town of Oak Ridge, a place where the pace of life was slow, and everyone knew everyone. The cobblestone streets were lined with old-fashioned shops, family-owned businesses, and a handful of popular eateries. Among them stood Matthew's Grill, a bustling restaurant in the heart of the town square. Run by the sharp-tongued and arrogant Henry Matthews, the grill was known for its delicious food but infamous for its unspoken rule: not everyone was welcome. On this particular afternoon, a tall, distinguished man named John Carter arrived in Oak Ridge. John, a 65-year-old black veteran, had spent decades serving his country and was now ready to enjoy his retirement in peace. He had chosen this town because it reminded him of the small, quiet communities he had visited in his youth. But what he didn't know was that Oak Ridge harbored deeply rooted prejudices, and newcomers like him were often met with suspicion, or worse. John was dressed in a simple, well-worn veteran uniform. His polished boots clicked against the cobblestones as he strolled down the street, taking in the sights. Despite the warmth of the day, a few passers-by gave him cold stares. John had experienced this before, subtle signs of discomfort or disdain, but he had learned to let it slide. His years in the military had taught him patience and composure, even in the face of hostility. As he walked past Matthew's Grill, the savory aroma of grilled meat and fresh bread wafted through the air, making his stomach rumble. It had been a long morning of unpacking and settling into his new home, and he decided he deserved a good meal. Smiling to himself, he pushed open the door to the restaurant. The moment John stepped inside, the lively chatter in the room came to an abrupt halt. Heads turned, and the clinking of silverware ceased. The diners stared at him, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to open disapproval. John, accustomed to such reactions, held his head high and walked up to the counter where Henry Matthews stood. Henry, a burly man in his late 50s with a permanent scowl etched on his face, sized John up with a look of thinly veiled contempt. Known for his bigoted views, Henry had built a reputation for treating people of color with disdain, though he rarely faced consequences in this tight-knit, insular community. "Good afternoon," John said politely, his deep voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. "I'd like a table for one, please." Henry crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "We're full," he said flatly. John glanced around the restaurant. Half the tables were empty, their pristine white tablecloths gleaming in the sunlight streaming through the windows. "It looks like you have plenty of room," John replied, his tone calm and measured. "I said we're full," Henry snapped, his voice louder now. The room grew even quieter, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. John's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Sir, I don't mean to cause any trouble. I'm a veteran, and all I'm asking for is a meal. I'm happy to wait if needed." Henry's lips curled into a sneer. "I don't care if you're a veteran or the president. This is my restaurant, and I get to decide who I serve. And I'm telling you, this ain't the place for people like you." A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the diners exchanged uneasy glances, while others nodded in agreement with Henry. No one spoke up in John's defense. John took a slow, deep breath, his fists clenching at his sides. He had fought for the freedoms of men like Henry, only to be treated like this. But he refused to let anger get the better of him. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, thank you for your time." With that, he turned and walked out of the restaurant, his head held high despite the humiliation burning in his chest. As the door swung shut behind him, Henry muttered loudly, "Good riddance." The room erupted into laughter, and the lively chatter resumed. Outside, John paused on the sidewalk, staring back at the restaurant. His expression was unreadable, but his mind raced with thoughts. One day, he murmured to himself, "You'll realize who I am." John didn't know it yet, but fate had something extraordinary in store. What Henry and the rest of the town didn't realize was that John Carter wasn't just any man. And more importantly, his son wasn't just anyone either. The next day in Oakridge began like any other, peaceful and predictable. The townsfolk went about their routines, exchanging pleasantries as they passed each other on the cobblestone streets. But this tranquil morning was about to be interrupted by the arrival of someone who would change the dynamic of the town forever. A sleek black car rolled into the town square, catching the attention of everyone nearby. The vehicle was a luxury sedan, a make and model rarely seen in a place like Oakridge. It came to a smooth stop in front of the quaint shops and diners, and the driver's door opened. Out stepped a tall, striking man dressed in an impeccably tailored suit. The man was Marcus Carter, John Carter's son. In his mid-30s, Marcus was a self-made entrepreneur whose success had catapulted him into the world of fame and influence. As the CEO of a multinational tech company and a well-known philanthropist, Marcus was no stranger to the spotlight. But today, he wasn't here on business or to bask in the glow of his achievements. He had come to visit his father, unaware of the incident that had unfolded at Matthew's Grill just the day before. Marcus's presence caused a stir. Shopkeepers peered out of their windows, and pedestrians paused to stare. Whispers spread like wildfire, who is he? Why is he here, Unfazed by the attention, Marcus glanced at his phone for directions and made his way to his father's modest home on the outskirts of town. The sight of the humble house filled him with a mix of pride and sadness. His father had always chosen a life of simplicity, even when Marcus had offered to buy him something more extravagant. John opened the door to find Marcus standing there, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Marcus! What a surprise," he said, pulling his son into a tight embrace. "I couldn't stay away, Dad," Marcus replied, stepping inside. "I wanted to see how you're settling in." The two sat down, catching up on life and reminiscing about old times. But as they talked, Marcus noticed something was off. His father's usual cheerfulness seemed dimmed, and there was a heaviness in his voice. "Dad, is everything okay?" Marcus asked, concern etched on his face. John hesitated, then sighed deeply. "Something happened yesterday," he admitted. "I went to a restaurant in town, Matthew's Grill star. Thought I'd treat myself to a nice meal. But the owner, he refused to serve me. Said it wasn't a place for people like me." Marcus's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. "He what?" "He made it clear I wasn't welcome," John continued. "It wasn't the first time I've faced something like this, and it probably won't be the last. But I'll be fine, son. I've dealt with worse." Marcus was silent for a moment, his mind racing. He had always admired his father's ability to rise above adversity, but this was different. The thought of someone disrespecting the man who had sacrificed so much for his country, and for him, filled Marcus with anger. "I can't just let this slide, Dad," Marcus said firmly. "What that man did was wrong. He needs to be held accountable." John placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Marcus, I appreciate your concern, but don't go stirring up trouble. People like him, they don't change easily." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already made up. "I understand," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Later that day, Marcus decided to see the restaurant for himself. He wanted to understand the kind of man who had treated his father so poorly. Dressed casually to avoid drawing attention, Marcus entered Matthew's Grill. Henry Matthews was standing behind the counter, chatting with a group of regulars. When he saw Marcus, his demeanor shifted. He plastered on a fake smile, clearly impressed by Marcus's appearance. "Welcome to Matthew's Grill," Henry said warmly. "Can I get you a table?" Marcus nodded, taking a seat by the window. As he waited for a menu, he observed the interactions around him. Henry and his staff treated the white customers with warmth and familiarity, but their behavior toward people of color was noticeably colder. When a young black couple walked in, Henry greeted them with the same disdain he had shown John. "We're full," he told them, despite several empty tables being visible. The couple left quietly, looking embarrassed. Marcus's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a one-time incident, it was a pattern. Henry Matthews was a man who thrived on prejudice, and Marcus knew he couldn't let it continue. As he finished his meal, Marcus overheard a conversation at a nearby table. A customer was praising Henry for running the best restaurant in town and for keeping it selective. Henry chuckled and said, "I only serve the right kind of people." Marcus smiled to himself, though it wasn't a smile of amusement. He had seen enough. Rising from his seat, he left the restaurant, a plan already forming in his mind. Henry Matthews had no idea who he had just served, or what was about to come his way. After his first encounter with Matthews' Grill, Marcus Carter returned to his father's house, his mind swirling with thoughts. The image of Henry Matthews, arrogant, bigoted, and smug, was burned into his memory. The way Henry dismissed and humiliated his father, and others like him, wasn't just an insult, it was a reflection of a deep-seated problem in the town. That evening, Marcus sat down with John, determined to learn more about what had happened. "Dad, tell me exactly how it went," he said, his voice calm but resolute. John hesitated but finally relented, recounting every detail, the cold stares, Henry's mocking tone, and the humiliation of being turned away as if he were less than human. Marcus listened intently, his fists clenched in his lap. "I've been through worse, son," John said with a sad smile. "This isn't the first time, and it won't be the last. I just want to live my life in peace." Marcus nodded, but his silence spoke volumes. He respected his father's ability to endure hardship with grace, but Marcus wasn't one to let injustice go unchecked. The next morning, Marcus decided to visit the restaurant again, this time, not as an observer, but with a purpose. He dressed casually, blending in with the town's atmosphere, and arrived just before the lunchtime rush. Henry Matthews was at his usual spot behind the counter, barking orders at his staff. He barely glanced up when Marcus walked in, though his mood seemed a bit lighter after the lucrative morning business. Marcus took a seat at a corner table, strategically positioned to watch the interactions around him. A waitress approached, handing him a menu with a polite smile. "What can I get for you today, sir?" she asked. "Just a coffee for now," Marcus replied, smiling back. As he waited, Marcus observed the dynamic in the restaurant. The regular customers, mostly white, were greeted warmly, with Henry often stepping out from behind the counter to chat or shake hands. But whenever someone who didn't fit Henry's preferred profile walked in, his demeanor shifted. A young black couple entered, smiling nervously as they glanced around. Henry immediately approached them, blocking their path. "Sorry, folks, we're full," he said curtly. The woman looked confused, gesturing toward the empty tables. "But we're full," Henry repeated, his voice firmer. Without another word, the couple left, their shoulders slumped. Marcus's jaw tightened as he watched. This was more than just a single incident, this was a pattern of behavior. Henry returned to the counter, oblivious to Marcus's presence. Marcus's coffee arrived, and he took his time sipping it, listening to the conversations around him. At a nearby table, a group of older men were talking about the restaurant. "Henry runs a tight ship," one of them said, nodding approvingly. "Keeps out the riffraff. That's why this place stays so nice." Another man chuckled. "Yeah, you don't see troublemakers in here, that's for sure." Marcus's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just about Henry's prejudice, it was a sentiment shared by many in the town. He made a mental note to address that later. Finishing his coffee, Marcus approached the counter. Henry glanced up, giving him a cursory nod. "Everything good?" he asked, his tone polite but distracted. "Great, thanks," Marcus replied, his smile unreadable. "You run a fine place here." Henry's chest puffed up slightly at the compliment. "Appreciate that. We like to keep it that way." "I can see that," Marcus said, his voice light but deliberate. "Only the right kind of people, right?" Henry hesitated, then smirked. You could say that. Marcus nodded, as though agreeing. Well, I'll be sure to recommend this place to my friends. I'm sure they'll love it. With that, Marcus paid his bill and left the restaurant. As he walked out, his expression changed, his calm, polite facade gave way to determination. He had all the information he needed. Now it was time to act. Later that day, Marcus began making calls. His connections in the media, business, and legal circles were vast, and he intended to use every one of them. He reached out to a prominent journalist he knew, explaining the situation in detail. I need you to come to Oak Ridge, Marcus said. There's a story here that people need to hear. The journalist, intrigued, agreed to visit the town. Meanwhile, Marcus also contacted a local civil rights organization, informing them about Henry's discriminatory practices. By the time Marcus returned to his father's house that evening, his plan was in motion. What are you up to, son? John asked, noticing the determined look in Marcus's eyes. Marcus smiled. Just leveling the playing field, Dad. It's time people like Henry Matthews learn that their actions have consequences. John sighed, a mix of pride and concern. I hope you know what you're doing. Don't worry, Marcus replied. This isn't about revenge. It's about justice. And trust me, justice is coming. The town of Oak Ridge was still blissfully unaware of what was about to unfold. For years, Henry Matthews had operated his restaurant under an unspoken code of exclusion, using subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, tactics to drive away customers he deemed undesirable. But this time, he had made a mistake. He had humiliated the wrong man's father. The morning after his second visit to Matthews' Grill, Marcus Carter's carefully laid plan began to take shape. Journalists from a prominent online news platform arrived in Oak Ridge, their cameras ready to document the story. Marcus had shared enough details to pique their interest, but he knew the real power of the story would lie in the testimonies of those who had experienced discrimination firsthand. Marcus spent the morning walking through the town, speaking to people of color who lived there. He found them in local parks, community centers, and even on the quiet streets. At first, many of them were hesitant to talk, fearing backlash from the tight-knit, judgmental community. But Marcus's sincerity and determination slowly won them over. I'm not just here for my father, Marcus told them. I'm here for everyone who's been treated unfairly. Your voice matters, and the world needs to hear it. One by one, the stories came out. A black mother who was denied service at Matthews' Grill while her children watched in confusion. A Hispanic man who had been told to take his business elsewhere. An Asian American couple who had been ignored by the waitstaff until they left in frustration. Each story painted a picture of systemic exclusion that had been swept under the rug for far too long. By midday, the journalists had enough material to publish a damning exposé. They began filming interviews, capturing the raw emotion of those who had endured Henry Matthews's discriminatory behavior. Marcus stood alongside them, lending his support and encouraging the townspeople to speak their truth. Meanwhile, back at Matthews' Grill, Henry Matthews was oblivious to the storm brewing outside his doors. The lunch rush was in full swing, and the restaurant buzzed with activity. Henry was in his element, chatting with his regulars and barking orders at his staff. That's when the first sign of trouble appeared. A young woman entered the restaurant, a microphone in hand and a cameraman trailing behind her. She approached the counter confidently, her presence turning heads. Mr. Matthews, she asked, her voice loud enough to cut through the din. Henry looked up, startled. Yeah, that's me. What's this about? I'm Amanda Reed from News Watch Daily, the journalist said, extending her hand. Henry didn't take it. We're here to ask you about allegations of discriminatory practices at your establishment. Do you have a moment to comment? The room fell silent. Customers exchanged uneasy glances, and Henry's face turned red. Discrimination, he scoffed. That's ridiculous. I don't know where you're getting your information, but this is a respectable business. Amanda didn't back down. Several individuals have come forward with claims that they were denied service here based on their race or ethnicity. We'd like to give you an opportunity to respond. Henry's eyes darted around the room, his discomfort evident. I don't know what you're talking about, he said gruffly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a business to run. Amanda turned to the camera. This is the response from Mr. Matthews, the owner of Matthews Grill. We'll continue our investigation and update you as more details emerge. The journalists left as abruptly as they had arrived, leaving Henry fuming. He glanced around at his customers, some of whom were already whispering amongst themselves. Can you believe this nonsense, he said, trying to regain control of the room. People will say anything these days. But the damage had been done. Within hours, the exposé was live on social media, accompanied by video interviews with the victims. The headline read, "Discrimination in Oak Ridge, the ugly truth behind Matthews Grill." The story spread like wildfire. Comments flooded in, condemning Henry's actions and calling for justice. Some locals defended him, claiming the accusations were exaggerated, but the overwhelming majority sided with the victims. By evening, Marcus's phone was buzzing non-stop. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers reached out to commend him for taking a stand. But Marcus wasn't done yet. The next morning, he filed a formal complaint with the state's Human Rights Commission, citing multiple instances of racial discrimination at Matthews Grill. He also partnered with the local civil rights organization to organize a peaceful protest outside the restaurant. The protest was scheduled for the following weekend, and word spread quickly. People from neighboring towns began pledging their support, promising to stand in solidarity with the victims. At home, John watched the events unfold with a mix of pride and apprehension. You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest, son, he said, shaking his head. Marcus smiled. Sometimes, Dad, the nest needs to be stirred. It's the only way to make real change. As the weekend approached, tension in Oak Ridge grew. Henry Matthews, once the town's most confident businessman, now faced the possibility of losing everything. And yet, he still had no idea who Marcus Carter really was, or the full extent of what was coming his way. The weekend arrived, and Oak Ridge was abuzz with anticipation. Word of the planned protest had reached every corner of the town, and tensions were at an all-time high. Henry Matthews had spent the past few days in a state of defiance, refusing to apologize or acknowledge the accusations against him. But deep down, he was beginning to feel the weight of the consequences. Saturday morning dawned with a crisp chill in the air, but the temperature didn't deter the protesters. By noon, a crowd had gathered outside Matthews Grill, their signs held high and their voices unified in chants demanding justice. The protesters weren't just people of color, they included allies from all walks of life, standing together to denounce prejudice. Marcus Carter stood at the front of the crowd, a commanding presence in his simple attire. Beside him was Amanda Reed, the journalist who had broken the story, along with representatives from the civil rights organization. Inside the restaurant, Henry Matthews paced nervously, peering out the window at the growing crowd. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a simmering mix of anger and fear. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to his staff, who looked equally uneasy. As the chants outside grew louder, Marcus stepped forward to address the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice clear and steady. "This isn't just about one man or one restaurant. This is about standing up to injustice, wherever it exists. My father, John Carter, is a veteran who served this country with honor. He has faced challenges most of us can't imagine, and yet he has always held his head high. But when he walked into this restaurant, he was treated as though his service, his sacrifices, and his dignity didn't matter." The crowd murmured in agreement, their signs waving in the air. Marcus continued, his voice growing more passionate. "This isn't just about my father. It's about every person who has been turned away, ignored, or belittled because of the color of their skin. We are here today to say that this stops now. The crowd erupted in applause, their energy fueling Marcus's resolve. Inside, Henry gritted his teeth, his face flushed with anger. He stormed out of the restaurant, slamming the door behind him. "What the hell is going on here?" he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. The crowd quieted, all eyes turning toward him. Marcus stepped forward, meeting Henry's glare with calm determination. "Mr. Matthews," Marcus said evenly, "this protest is about holding you accountable for your actions. Your discriminatory practices have hurt countless people, and it's time for that to end." Henry scoffed, crossing his arms. "I run my business the way I see fit. If people don't like it, they can go somewhere else." The crowd erupted in boos, but Marcus raised a hand to silence them. "That attitude is exactly the problem," he said. "This isn't about personal preference. It's about human dignity. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Henry opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, Amanda Reed stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Mr. Matthews, would you care to explain why multiple customers have come forward with stories of being denied service at your establishment? Do you deny their claims?" Henry faltered, the weight of the accusations finally sinking in. I don't have to explain myself to you," he stammered. Amanda didn't back down. "So you're not denying the allegations?" Henry looked around, his eyes darting from the crowd to the cameras. His silence spoke volumes. The crowd began chanting again, their voices growing louder with every word, "No more hate. No more hate." As the protest continued, Marcus received a call from his legal team. The Human Rights Commission had launched an investigation into Matthews' Grill, and Henry's discriminatory practices were now officially under scrutiny. But Marcus wasn't done yet. That evening, he hosted a town hall meeting at the community center, inviting everyone in Oak Ridge to attend. The event was packed, with people eager to discuss the issues that had come to light. Marcus began by sharing his father's story, followed by testimonials from others who had been mistreated. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, as residents realized the need for change. By the end of the meeting, a resolution was proposed, a community-driven initiative to promote inclusivity and diversity in Oak Ridge. Local business owners pledged to adopt anti-discrimination policies, and a task force was formed to ensure accountability. As for Henry Matthews, the fallout was swift. His reputation was in shambles, and his restaurant began losing customers by the day. Facing mounting pressure and legal challenges, Henry eventually issued a public apology, though many questioned its sincerity. Meanwhile, John Carter watched the events unfold with a mix of pride and humility. "You've done something incredible, Marcus," he said, his voice filled with emotion. Marcus smiled, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "I couldn't have done it without your example, Dad. You taught me to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it gets." In the weeks that followed, Oak Ridge began to change. The protest had sparked a movement, and people were more mindful of how they treated one another. It wasn't a perfect transformation, but it was a start, a step toward a better, more inclusive future. And as for Marcus Carter, he left Oak Ridge knowing that his father, and countless others, would no longer have to endure the indignity of being made to feel unwelcome in their own town. Thank you for watching my YouTube channel Storytime. If you like this story, please like, subscribe and share. Please support me.